Hi, my name is Gary Ramirez. I'm going to be presenting Jack the Ripper, the unsolved case for forensics class. So the background: in 1888, Whitechapel area of London was terrorized by murders. There was an increase of immigrants from Ireland as well as Jewish refugees from East Europe and Russia. Due to crowding and the poverty, violence, abuse, and prostitution were like at the rise. An estimate of 1,200 prostitutes and 62 brothels um, had happened at the time. So the crimes that occur on April 3rd, 1888, February 13th, 1890 to 1891, a total of 11 murders titled the Whitechapel murders occurred. So the victims were Mary Ann Nichols, May 31st, 1888, Anne Chapman, September 8th, 1888, Elizabeth Sarai, September 30th, 1888, Catherine Eddowes, September 30th, 1888, and Mary Jane Kelly, November 9th, 1888. Mainly, like the similarity between all of them were that they were all prostitutes, and it was suspected that Jack the Ripper stopped after he had killed Kelly. But it's also suspected that he killed around 13 people in total instead of just these five, but these five were discovered, and these were the five that um, he technically admitted. So suspects interrogation. So I put them both because it wasn't really like interrogation. I'll explain it later, but it was more just like suspects that they seen around, because you can see how like general these suspects are. So the first was Prince Albert Victor. He could have performed these murders because he had fits of like insanity when because he suffered of syphilis. It could have also been, which is very vague, it could have been anyone at the time, but I guess because it was a small area, Whitechapel, that they suspected him because he was the only like madman out. Montague John Druitt, after he had died in a creek, they found his body dead in a creek. The murders had just stopped abruptly after him, so they just suspected that maybe him, because after his death, the murders just stopped, but it could have been a coincidence. Walter Sickert, he was an impressionist painter who was obsessed with the Ripper, so he'd like paint him all the time and talk about him all the time, which is why like a lot of the art shown is made by Walter Sickert. Like a lot of the over exaggerated pictures of Jack the Ripper, because no one really found out who it was. Robert Mann was a mortician that he was the one that investigated and observed the body, so they thought maybe it could have been him, because if it was him, he had control of over what could have been said. And once again, like this is all very generalized, but it was back in 1888, didn't have too much evidence to work with, as I'll explain later. They also suspected that it might have been Joe the Ripper. That's like the pseudonym they gave instead of Jack the Ripper, because the saliva they discovered on the envelopes that he mailed the cops, because he wrote letters to them, as I'll explain later. But they tested it to see, and they found out that it was traces of a woman. So they thought that maybe Joe the Ripper could have been a woman. And then lastly, Karl Feinbaum. He was a German sailor who had already previously killed a woman in NYC. So but he had also been to the Whitechapel brothels, which is where he could have picked up some of these prostitutes, because they were all prostitutes. So they like suggested that it might have been him, because he already had a history of killing women. But there was many others. Like these are just some, and to this day it's still open, and people still think that there are other suspects, because these are once again general. There's like more than like 100 now. Like there's a bunch, but these were like the top 5 that I could find. So the motives of the suspect: the Ripper once again sent many letters explaining these brutal acts of murder. So he mentioned how like they were whores, and how he wanted to get rid of them, how it was like a game or a job. He mentioned, some of them, they said that it could have been him, or could have been someone like copying him, because some of them, because the one that they suspected was mainly him was the one that was badly written, like English, because a lot of his like English was broken, because some letters came in perfect English, others came in broken English. And they were also all written with red ink, like to make fun of the fact that he was using like the blood or something of the victims. But it most likely was the one with bad handwriting, because the one with bad grammar, because that one, it was when he mailed a kidney from the victims, because he'd take trophies from them, and it was it was, I think, Elizabeth, and it was her kidney, because they tested it, and that's why they say like it's most likely that letter. But because they say like what happened, and like they like specifically say like how good he was at cutting them and cleaning it up, that they suspected that he might have been a doctor. But because the letter that most likely was actually written by him was in such broken grammar, they knew that doctors have to go to like medical school and they have to learn proper grammar. So the fact that he wrote in broken grammar suggested that maybe he might have not been a doctor. So it was like a lot of like this proves this, but then the other thing like disproves that. You know, it was really confusing at the time. So yeah. So profile of Jack the Ripper. There was a few eyewitness reports, and they said that like he appeared to be like a resident male in his late 20s, that he was tall and stocky, that he was also might have been local. This was then, and then the rest is by the police. They said he was probably employed, because murders generally occurred at the weekend, so he might have been busy during the weekdays working. He was single without family ties, because the murders would take place between 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. because then like during that time, you know, if you have a family or a second life, like a real life, like you'll probably be busy doing that instead of just killing randomly. So he was probably like free and like got to do whatever he wanted whenever. Also, it was like of low class, because the murders showed lack of care and attention. Like he was very good at like leaving no clues behind, but he wasn't like really like thoughtful of like, you know, taking them, like, you know, like coddling them or like wrapping them nicely. Like he just leave the bodies there, but made sure not to get any evidence just for him. But as for like the prostitutes, he didn't care how he treated them or anything. So they thought that maybe that's a sign of low class. But in other reports, it says that he was gentle with the bodies. So I'm not too sure, but it might have just been in order to prevent any more clues from transferring off of him. And although like the cuts were clean, he wasn't surgically skilled. Like he wasn't able to cut the kidneys out and stuff like that cleanly. Like it was like cleaned up, but it wasn't like well thought out and methodically like cut out and stuff, like a surgeon would know. They said that maybe it might have been a past offender, because like a lot of the suspects were past offenders. And maybe he might have been seen as a loner, and he could have been abused by a mother or womanly figure, which is why he targeted prostitutes and stuff. So the investigation. They were left with 5 bodies, although other bodies appeared, but the 5 bodies was really what they focused on, because Jack the Ripper, he in the letters and stuff, he seemed to address them a lot. He really left no clues and was quite clever with like the murders, but the investigators tried their hardest what they could, like to piece together what they could, because once again he was very like, he thought about how to clean it up and not leave evidence behind, but he wasn't very methodical on how cutting it out and stuff, like being clean and neat. So the modus operandi, it's a lot. This is by the artist, like the overdrawn look of him, like what the suspected looked like, but it's like an exaggeration. But the modus operandi, which is the way he handled the victims, what they said that he'd hold both of their hands, or like the victim had both of his hands like occupied, because they were probably going to engage in sexual intercourse because they were prostitutes, so they were probably like busy pulling up like the skirt or pulling it off or whatever, you know. So then her arms would probably most likely be busy doing that. And then while her hands were occupied, he would strike them on the head with whatever he had at the time, and then strangle them till they were dead or unconscious. And then he said that he would lower his victim's head to the floor to the left. The marks against their right cheek supported this argument. And there's also no signs of bruising, so which means, like, once again, like I told you, like, he lowered them gently without like bruising them, or leaving any signs. Like, because if he would have just let them fall, it would have probably caused cuts or bruises along the area where they were, which is probably the streets of Whitechapel. So, and then he would stay on the right side of the body and cut their throat. And this would prevent from the blood streams and the blood from flowing to him. So the blood spatters would show on the victim when they were laying down because it was cut that way. So like the way the blood spatter spewed, it was a certain direction. That's how they figured out how they cut them. And then that was to prevent also from the blood stains from getting to him. Once again, I told you, like, he didn't leave many clues. And he thought about that, but not very much, like, atomically. Like, he couldn't really cut things neatly. And then he would take trophies or, like, organs of the body, of the victim's bodies, like the kidney or the arm, and, like, he also, like, nailed in an ear. It was a lot. So the trial. So there wasn't really a trial back then in the 18th century. It was just in the 1800s because it just had been kept open. You know, back then there wasn't many. They said that the police investigators would kind of just go to door to door and get eyewitnesses and gather as much information. And then they would just like write it down and record it for later use. And it's not really like they had like this whole trial because it was small and they couldn't really know what to do. Like, they didn't know who it was. It was more just interrogating, finding suspects, and they just kind of kept it open and kind of almost hoped for him to come clean or find enough evidence to find him because he did send enough letters, but after a certain time it just stopped after like 5, which so they say, but they said that maybe it might have been 13 or 11. So, you know, we don't really know. There wasn't really like a complete trial because it was so long ago, but it's that's why like I don't have much information. So why does this case remain unsolved? So there was many reasons, like including lack of evidence, you know, the circumstances back then, you know, a lot of misinformation, false testimony, and tight regulations by Scotland Yard, which I'll explain. Jack the Ripper has been a topic of the news for 120 years. You know, there's a bunch of stuff. There's movies and books and creepypastas and stories that were written over Jack the Ripper. He's a very it's a very famous case that people still talk about today and is still very much open. But and in 2011, British detective Trevor Marriott, he was in charge of he was very invested in the case. So to this day, till recent times, he was still investigating who it could have been. But he was actually denied access to uncensored documents surrounding the case of Jack the Ripper by the Metropolitan Police, and this was due because they include protected information and police informants that if they handed over the documents would impede on the possibility of future testimonies by modern day informants. So they feel that if they had given up this information, people who could have been, testimonies, their testimonies would be thrown out because it had too much information in the file. So they didn't really trust him to have it, and they weren't really allowed to give it to him, which is why it kind of got cold after that. End.